People at the back, again, if you want to come forward, you're very welcome to. There's still a little bit of space on the sides. Awesome. I think we're probably breaking enough fire regulations now. So it's, yeah, if there is a fire, I'm really sorry, especially for you guys at the front who got here early and therefore will have absolutely no chance of getting out. So who am I? My name is Michael Cullum. That's my Twitter handle. If you want to tweet abuse at me, feedback, I'm going to be standing up here for the next 40 minutes, so I'm completely defenseless. And you can say whatever you like about me, and I can't do anything about it. See, I'm muted, but yeah, I'm still making noises. This is... I have not, I'm just going to leave it. Oh, that's you guys tweeting me. So every single... Okay, could you just not tweet for the next 40 minutes? Ignore exactly what I just said, and please nobody tweet me, because otherwise that's just going to keep pinging. I'm a Brit, in case you can't tell from my accent. Something... The thing is, I can see you all getting your phones out. Okay. Something I used to be quite proud of until Brexit happened. I'm also on the management team of phpBB. If you want to come talk to me about that, then there's a few team members back there somewhere, and too embarrassed to cheer. I also have stickers and stuff if you want to find me afterwards. And I'm a PHP Fig secretary. I'm going to talk a bit about what the fig is later on, so don't really worry about that. But thank you. But you don't care about any of that. You don't care who I am. You're here to talk about interoperability. But first, I want to give a bit of a history lesson. And first of all, we're going to go back to 1994. Anyone know what happened in 1994? Any big events? Did anyone get married in 1994? No, nobody got married in 1994. Anyone have anyone born in 1994? Okay, one guy. Well done. Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa. China got the internet, albeit in a slightly modified form, and Harry Styles and Justin Bieber were born. That is all that happened in 1994. That is it. I looked at a Wikipedia page of important events that happened in 1994. I have no idea why Justin Bieber and Harry Styles being born is considered an important event, but apparently, Wikipedia, right? That's a lie, because one other thing happened. PHP was invented. Which is the reason that you're all now currently cramped in a room that is a huge fire hazard. So if there is a fire, you can blame 1994. PHP was initially created by Rasmus for two things. Perl documentation, slightly ironic, seeing as it then became a competitor, and to track visitors to his resume. I don't think he really anticipated the effect it was going to have on his resume, but we'll leave it at that. Moving forward, 1998, we had PHP 3. PHP 2 in the middle, we had Zeev and Andy. They basically came in and rewrote the PHP engine. Has anyone heard of a company called Zend? Most of you, I hope. Or I suspect, rather. That's actually formed of their two names, Zeddy from Zeev and ND from Andy. They rewrote the Zend engine, which is what powers PHP today. And this sort of was when PHP was starting to become a little bit more of a usable language for packages. And has anyone used phplib in the room? A few of you, fantastic. Last time I did this talk, this subset of this talk, only one person put his hand up, so you're all very old. Whatever. And it was the first PHP framework. It was the Symfony of its day, I guess. Now nobody uses it. I hope that people will remember Symfony in 10 years' time, and we'll have a few more hands, but yeah. And Pair came around. Pair, we're sort of looking towards 2000. Now we're saying goodbye to Pair, apparently. But all of these things were indicative of an environment that fostered creating lots and lots of different projects. In 2000, Drupal became a thing. phpBB became a thing around about 1999, 2000. WordPress came about in 2003, Symfony 2005, Joomla in 2005, Zend Framework in 2006. And this led to lots of these little ecosystems in which you could have packages work together really well, and companies would form around these particular ecosystems. You know, we've got the Drupal ecosystem up here with Acquia and Palantir, companies that are supporting that ecosystem. But then we've got the Symfony ecosystem, in which you've got things like Twig, SwiftMailer, you've got the FOSS bundles. You have all of these different companies and bundles and applications that are within these little spheres. You know, Laravel here, we've got a WordPress bubble here, we have a Zend Framework bubble here. The PHP ecosystem was lots and lots of different silos, and the thing is they didn't really talk to each other. There was a lack of centralization. There was no PHP central kind of thing. You had internals, but that wasn't really dedicated towards projects. You didn't have dependency management in the kind of way that we have right now. Composer, interesting story, was created by Niels and Jordi after there were two different things going on, essentially. Is Niels in the room? No, he's upstairs. Jordi? Okay, neither of them are here. Fab, so if I make a mistake, they won't know about it. So essentially it was created after a discussion in Symfony Live Paris a number of years ago, and essentially Niels was saying that for phpBB he wanted something to manage dependencies of packages in phpBB. And at the same time Fabian and Jordi were like, well, we kind of have this really rubbish bin vendors thing going on with Symfony. So this is a problem for more than just phpBB. So then Niels went and wrote a stat solver for 6 months, which is kind of hard to do, converting stuff over from C. And then Jordi was working on the other bits. And now we have Composer, now we have proper package management. And as a result of that, we got a really nice package repository, Packagist. And whilst it used to be really difficult to include libraries, you know, due to the different packages, ecosystems, conferences, all of these little silos, we had this divided community. And a friend of mine, Larry Garfield, who's actually sitting in the room for the first time that I'm mentioning this concept, because I talk about this concept all the time. And it's called Getting Off the Island. Has anyone heard of it? Well, obviously Larry has, yeah. The idea is that you have all of these different islands. So you might have a WordPress island. To be honest, actually, I'm kind of happy being an island if this is what it looks like. You know, I could live there. Who could live there? Yeah. So the WordPress island looks kind of nice. phpBB island looks just as nice. That's the one I chose, apparently. Joomla is an island. Symfony is an island. You have companies that are their own islands as well. And these islands are you as well. This is Lord Kitchener, who's the Your Country Needs You for the UK, the British Uncle Sam kind of thing. And it's absolutely fine being your own island. You know, that's why PHP thrived as a community, is because each individual person knew exactly what they wanted to do. They could go off and they could create their own blog system. Who's created a blog application or library at some point in their career, especially whilst you were learning PHP? Almost the entire room. How many of those were as sophisticated as WordPress is, or Drupal, or something like that? Almost none of them. So it's a really good way of just creating those basic libraries yourself, and that's why PHP thrived. If we hadn't been able to create those blog systems, we might not have picked up a certain the knowledge that we gained from that. But we're breaking the mold. One mind is great. One mind can come up with many things. You know, Fabian is a very intelligent individual. But as soon as you add another person's mind, then you don't just have 2 times the brain power, the ideas. You also have the things that come from those people bouncing off of each other. If Drupal and PHP work together on an authentication system, for example, then you would not only get Drupal's needs covered and PHP's needs covered, but you would actually abstract things further, and you would come up with brand new ideas that neither of which would ever think of in their own library systems. You wouldn't think of if you just had their 2 brains together, but you come up with this fusion of ideas. We stopped reinventing the wheel. We started using components, we started using other libraries, and this is a huge thing for PHP community. You know, projects like Drupal, WordPress, PHP, we didn't use other people's code. We had our own templating engine. We would have our own database abstraction layer. We would have our own dependency injection container. We'd have our own event dispatcher. There are 3 things, in my opinion, that contributed to this changing. One was object-oriented programming. PHP 4 had OOP. Who remembers PHP 4 OOP? Quite a few of you. Who doesn't remember PHP 4 OOP? A few of you. Welcome. PHP 4 OOP was really ugly. It worked-ish. But PHP 5 does OOP a lot more properly. And this contributed to being able to include libraries safely within your application. You could have lots of these different parts of your application. It would all work together. Also namespacing. Composer. Composer, I've already mentioned Composer. I've talked about Composer. Does anyone in this room not know what Composer is about? Great. If you'd asked that in a talk 5 years ago, half the room would have raised their hands, even at a Symfony conference. That just shows the way we've come. And from Composer, Packages, that way of having all of these different bundles, and the PHP Fig, that thing that I mentioned earlier that I said I was going to talk about in a bit. And I'll still talk about it in a bit, but I'm not going to talk about it yet. Apparently I am. So what is the Fig? It's kind of like the PHP Congress. By the way, this is an image done by a friend, and it says, "In PHP we trust." Don't trust PHP. But it's an accumulation of lots of different member projects of representatives, like a Congress, like a House of Commons, House of Parliament. I don't know what you have in Germany. Do you have some kind of parliament thing with people? Or do you just have... I don't know how your legal system works. So you have lots of different representatives, and they're representing different PHP projects, because that's what the PHP community is formed of, right? It's formed of PHP projects. They're the only people that matter. It's not true. We'll get to that. It's also a bit like the United Nations of PHP, in that everyone there has their own interests, and sometimes they're at war with each other, sometimes they're competitors. Zend Framework and Symfony are competitors, although Zend Framework is now using Symfony components. Who won that battle? Sorry, just don't tell Matthew I said that. But the thing is that they still have common aims. The security of the world, the peace of the world, that's a common aim of the United Nations. We don't want to all be at war. That's in the same way, the PHP Fig, which stands for the PHP Framework Interoperability Group, has common aims, namely interoperability. Hence, interoperability group. The PHP Fig produces PSRs, PHP standards recommendations. The most important word in this is probably recommendation. You don't have to follow them. We're not telling you what to do. That's not how it works. We're giving you something which you can follow if you like. It's something that a lot of projects might be using. And therefore, if you want to be compatible with those projects, then you can use this. It's a recommendation. It's not something you have to do. And it's perfectly valid for projects to not follow it. Symfony doesn't follow PSR7, which is HTTP message, which we'll talk about in a bit. So we have a whole string of different PSRs that are related to interoperability, but we also do non-interoperability stuff as well. We have working groups which form for other concerns as well. So we have PSR12 and PSR2, which cover coding style guidelines, which does not affect interoperability except for PSR1. We also have PSR 9 and 10, which are related to security concerns and how to deal with that, and trying to find a common way between different PHP projects to handle those. So it's not all about interoperability, but the vast majority of them are. So PSRs. PSR3 was probably the first, so we have PSR 0 and PSR 4, which were auto-loading. I'm not going to go into those. You've all used Composer. I guess you kind of have had interaction with that. PSR 3 is a logger PSR. So Geordie, who I mentioned earlier, who founded Composer, he also wrote this. He seems to have too much free time on his hands. It's a very simple library, and what it does is it provides a logger interface. You can do critical exceptions, you can do emergencies, it has all of these different levels. It also has a log method, which you can then pass in whichever one of the constants of the level you want to. It's a very simple interface. A cache interface, sorry. You can grab things from a pool. This pool interface is an object, so that might be your Redis database. This slide is slightly out of date, which is embarrassing. I should have changed that first line. Sorry. So you can see whether or not it has an item in that Redis. Does it have in this case, a Trump presidency item? It didn't at the time when we grabbed it from the cache. Obviously, the cache is out of date. TTL is too long. We can also get items from the cache. We can get Ryan's status, and it just so happens, and then that would return a cache item object. From that, we can then get a value. We can see that he's not here. This is Ryan Weaver, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know him. What is he doing? We can then set a new value of whatever's in that cache. He's looking after his new baby. We can then set a TTL and save that to the cache pool. That's just a very quick overview of how PSR6 works. PSR7 is a lot more complicated. PSR7 defines what an HTTP message should look like. And this is great for things like middlewares. It has 7 different interfaces. It's used by Zend frameworks in terms of expressive. It's used by Slim, StackPHP, but it's also used by HTTP clients like Guzzle. You have your core HTTP message, which is what every message looks like, and then you have the 2 more specific derivatives of a request and a response. And then you have a whole load of other stuff which you don't need to worry about, really. Well, not right now, anyway. And then PSR11. PSR11 is almost through in terms of it will be going to an approval vote very soon. And the very core of it is that it has 2 methods. It has a get and a set, get and a has. Does the container have this service? Yes or no? And you can also get an instance of that service. There are a whole load of other PSRs that I'm not going to go through and bore you with. That's not what you're here to learn about. You're not here to list and spew off PSRs. But we have, just to say what they are, PSR13 is about links. It's more related to DAV projects. PSR14 is about event managers, so event dispatchers and that kind of thing. PSR15 and 17 are HTTP factories and HTTP middlewares, and PSR16 is a simple cache library. So that provides a much nicer interface to use as a consumer of a library for caching, which is just a lot more simple because you don't have to deal with lots of different cache pools. You only deal with one cache pool that's just given to you. I would say go and see Nicholas's talk on if you want to hear more about caching, but he's already done it, so too late. Watch the videos when they get posted in like 6 months. Sorry, I mean say a few weeks. So interoperability, there are kind of 3 different angles that you can look at interoperability from. You can look at it from a library perspective. You can look at it from a decoupled business logic perspective or bridging applications. And I almost feel like the word interoperability is a really horrible word because it means 3 completely different things in these different contexts. There are 3 completely different ways of doing it. There are 3 different ways of handling it. There are 3 different sections of reasons that you should do it. So I feel almost like we should call it library interoperability stuff, decoupled business logic library interoperability stuff, and bridging applications interoperability stuff. Because interoperability is just this huge umbrella term that we just throw around quite lightly. Is anyone counting the number of times I'm saying the word interoperability in this talk? That would be probably quite an interesting thing to try and have a look at. So a library perspective, what does this make a difference in libraries? Dependency hell. Who has dependency hell? Yay! I have a dependency hell too. Dependency hell is an absolute nightmare because ultimately you sometimes get situations that look a little bit like this. Sorry if you can't. Can you read that at the back actually? I'm seeing some nodding. Obviously, if you don't, then maybe you should go to Specsavers. That's a joke. So library number 1. Let's say that we have this library and it requires monlog because it needs to do some logging. It requires Symfony cache because it needs to do some caching, and it requires Pimple in terms of because it has factories and therefore it needs to be able to know that there's a get method. And the thing is that we say that we're relying on interfaces and we're not relying on the specific libraries, but ultimately, if you don't know what the APIs of those libraries look like, so you can do dependency injection, and you can pass in a particular instance of Symfony cache in your main application, but you still have to be passing in Symfony cache. You can't just go and pass in another caching library. So then when you have library 2, which you go and include, and it says that, hey, we're using Klogger. Okay, I've never heard of that, but sure. We're also using Stash as our caching library. It's like, okay. And we're going to use a Zend framework dependency injection. It's like, right. how do I deal with this? I've got to have essentially 6 libraries that are doing 3 things. And in my main application, somehow I've got to have a way of creating instances of both of these things and then somehow sharing them back to the same place, because you don't want your caches all spread across. You don't have 8 different caching locations just because different libraries require it. And then you get a third library. And then that says, hey, I'm going to require analog for my logging. I'm going to go with a PHP cache for caching. And I kind of fancy the PHP lead container. It's like a good container for me to rely on the API of, at which point you've then got 3. But then in your application, you need to do some specific stuff that doesn't necessarily exist in these libraries. So in your business logic, you're saying that you want a monologue API for your logging. You're saying that for Symfony Cache, you want to have that particular interface. You want to use specific features. I know they're planning on adding a whole load that aren't necessarily in things like phpBB Cache at the moment. And Symfony Dependency Injection Container, because you have a Symfony full-stack framework, right? So you've got a whole load of different libraries doing the exact same thing, and you don't want to be doing that. You want to be abstracting that, because they don't actually depend on monologue. They depend on the interface of monologue, or they should be anyway if you're using solid principles. So we can sort this with PSRs in creating interfaces. So in this particular instance, we had, in our library 1, we had monologue. Now all that library says is, hey, just give me a PSR3 logger and I'm happy. Instead of Symfony Cache, it says, hey, give me a PSR6 library and I'm happy. And instead of Pimple, it says, give me a PSR11 library, and once again, I'm happy. I'm a very happy person at this point. Because now I can do the exact same thing for library 3, I can do the exact same thing for library 2, and I can do it in my business logic as well. So immediately, I've then gone from having to require 3 different login libraries, 3 different caching libraries, and 4 different dependency injection containers to just requiring 3. And I can choose those 3 in my application, because that's what applications should be able to do. Your applications should be able to choose what you're using to do your work. And that shouldn't be the responsibility of your individual libraries to dictate. But unfortunately, that's the way it used to be. Going back to what I was saying, and the reason I was talking about the history is that we ended up with this very distributed set of islands. And they didn't have to care about this. It wasn't a concern for them. Why would it be a concern of requiring an individual library when we weren't really including libraries? We just had all of our own stuff. So then when we started including libraries and libraries inside of libraries, we didn't really think about the fact that the application on top of us might already be requiring another library that serves the same purpose. So 10 dependencies of 3, that's a good start. And then you can choose. So I chose monologue, Symfony Cache, and Symfony Dependency Injection Container, because this is a Symfony conference, and I feel like Fabian would get annoyed at me if I didn't. You can also do drop-in replacements. This is the other side of library interoperability. Gary Hockin, anyone know Gary Hockin? JetBrains guy, talks a lot about PHP Storm. He also works on Zend Framework. In particularly, he manages the Zend Framework service container. And he and I were talking at PHP World, and he was saying actually when he uses, I think it was Slim, I might be wrong on that though. When he uses Slim, he doesn't really like the container that it's bundled with. So because it requires a PSR11 container, instead of having to use the Slim container, he can just pick that straight out and he can drop in Zends. And then it does magical stuff that only he knows about because he's the lead maintainer on it. And documentation isn't really a thing, right? So he was able to just take out this library and drop in another one. And he did that at the beginning of a project, simply because that was his personal preference, because it met his business needs, because it did some stuff that he needed it to. Who's heard of PPI? And I don't mean payment protection insurance. So PPI provides a whole load of different ways that you can use different modules from things like Zend Framework and Symfony all together in one project. It's kind of like an abstraction library. Instead of you depending on Symfony or depending on Zend Framework, you depend on PPI. And PPI will then just simply say, hey, if you want to use Symfony, that's cool. If you want to use Zend, that's cool. You can pick and choose. And that's all handled by PPI. It does all the conversions and stuff like that. It's essentially a kind of a huge bridge framework. I don't really know a really good way of wording it, but I mean that handles things like commands, it handles templating, routing, databases, and dependency injection. There are all of these different areas it will cover, and it will abstract that away from the actual framework for you. So all you have to depend on is PPI, and you can use any of the actual components to do the work that you choose for that particular need. If you've ever wanted to use a Zend framework component and a Symfony component together, this is a great way of doing it. Although I imagine with Zend Framework 3 and using Symfony components, this might be easier and without PPI now. Swapping out a library during development. Who's ever used one particular library for something and then found that then suddenly you want to do something with it and it doesn't do that, but this other library does, and then you've taken that library out and you've put in this new library? Who's done that? Almost all of you. Fab. How much work was that? Because it really depends on the situation as to whether or not that's just as simple as, hey, I'm just going to change that in my dependency, in my composers.json, and in my service container definitions. Or is it about 6 weeks worth of work and you're tearing your hair out and you end up refactoring your entire application just to change the way of doing this? And this is another discussion I had with Gary also at PHP World is, what is interoperability really about? And this is a really difficult thing to talk about and discuss and work out. Because does it mean that you should be able to just take out a library and drop in another? No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that at all. If you, well, I mean, not in terms of if you're doing that in your application, that's not a requirement. In a library, then yes, you should be able to drop it in and out. But in an already existing project, it's okay to rely on those extra features that Symfony Cache has that aren't included in PSR6. That's perfectly fine. But the thing is if you ever want to take out Symfony Cache, you don't want to have to rewrite your entire application just to change the library. You want to have as minimum friction as you possibly can. So yes, you can use tagging. But the fact is if you ever then go and change into a different caching library, you won't necessarily have those tags available. Or if you do, they might be on a slightly different interface. The idea of interfaces in terms of this and swapping out a library during development is to try and ease that process. It makes it a bit easier. And realistically, you might be able to just get away with just relying on the interface. And if you can, that's ideal. Then you can just swap that library out, and all of you, those of you that put your hand up just then, it would take a couple of hours instead of a few weeks. But it's okay at taking a few days. And that's kind of the point of interfaces in this particular instance, I think. And this kind of links back into solid principles. Dependency inversion principle says, and the exact quote is, one should depend upon extractions, do not depend on concretions. So you shouldn't be depending on an individual library, you should be depending on your interface. But that doesn't mean that the concrete library can't do some other stuff, and you can occasionally do that. So it's pragmatism versus perfectionism. So I talked about 3 different perspectives. Let's talk about another one. Let's talk about business logic. Changing frameworks. This is a really common argument for why you should use PSRs and you should use interfaces and stuff, or you should decouple your code, because you might change frameworks but keep your entire application the same. Now, who here has actually changed their framework in the middle of a project and not rewritten their entire application? Okay, like 3 of you, but my point is, what? Like, this is used as probably the biggest argument for abstracting, for decoupling. But nobody does it, except for 4 of you, and I feel sorry for you. Did you end up rewriting, basically? Or, yeah, exactly. So you didn't change frameworks, you rewrote your application. It's an awful argument. Don't use this argument. Please, can you just make an oath to me if you do nothing else from this talk and say that you will never use that you might change frameworks one day as a reason to decouple your business logic from the Symfony base controller or something. Use these other arguments instead. Your business logic should be just that. Your business logic should be your business logic. It shouldn't be your application management system. It shouldn't be your libraries that does stuff. It should be your business logic. An application could basically consist of 3 things. It should consist of your business logic. It should consist of your libraries and frameworks. That's the kind of stuff that just does stuff. It makes it work. It makes your caching, when you want to cache something, it means that it will handle actually persisting that to Redis, and you don't have to worry about that. And then you should have your glue. So you should have your libraries that will do these individual caching things. You should have your business logic. And then you need a way to link these. And your way of doing that is glue. So in the case of Silex, who's used Silex before? vast majority of you. So Silex, for those of you who haven't, Silex uses service providers, and I would describe that just as glue. Basically, that just adds a way in from your Pimple container to be able to access those libraries and those relevant services. In the same way in Symfony, I think one of the core pieces of glue is all of that stuff that's contained within your app kernel, those loading of bundles. So your bundles really should be your glue. And then your actual business logic should be in that app bundle. Who's read the Symfony best practices stuff? Yeah, quite a few of you. Or if you started Symfony in the past few years, then you'll have probably been introduced straight into that. So that recommends that you use an app bundle. And you can put all your business logic in there. And that's a great idea, because essentially it's not really a bundle. What bundles really, the core reason that bundles exist is to give you access to certain, I hesitate to use the word auto-wiring, because it's not auto-wiring, but it's kind of a little bit like that. But also it gives you, primarily it gives you access to the container. And that's why you create an app bundle. You're not actually really creating a bundle. All of your other bundles, they should be your glue. They're the things that take a library, which is completely abstract, like Monologue, and they turn it into something that can be used in a Symfony application. That's why we have a Monologue bundle and we have a Monologue library. It's because we have the glue, we have the library, and then within our actual app bundle, we should have our business logic. Does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone want to add anything into those three things that should be in an application? Cool. And essentially what I'm talking about here is just separation of concerns. Again, linking back in solid principles. Separation of concerns is really important, because if you start to intertwine all of your stuff that does stuff and your business logic, then what happens if you then, in a different part of your application, especially if you're using like a microservice architecture, what happens if you then want to do caching in another part of your application? You don't have this abstracted thing you can, and who's ever tried to decouple after the fact a whole load of code that actually does stuff? Essentially take a library out of their application. Yeah, who enjoyed that experience? Oh, three of you, okay. You can come and have a chat to me later, because I'm actually interested to hear about your experience. And maybe I'll learn something. So what can we actually decouple in terms of in our app bundle, specifically with Symfony? Probably about 10% of stuff, realistically. We talk about how we can decouple bundles and stuff, and Bo tomorrow afternoon, I believe, is speaking about this, so go and see his talk. So if we look at controllers, what's really in our controllers? We have our HTTP request and response. I'm starting off on a positive note, because this is something that we can abstract. We can handle PSR7 messages. In Symfony, this is a bit harder at the moment, because you have to use the bridge. The bridge performance can be a little bit dodgy sometimes. From what I'm told, I haven't actually benchmarked it myself, disclaimer there. However, you can still do that, and that also means that you can introduce middlewares elsewhere in your application using PSR 15 when it comes out, and PSR 7, which defines that interface. Form processing. There isn't really a way to abstract form processing. In your controller, you would have methods like isValid and stuff like that. There, you're introducing a direct dependency on the Symfony form component. In the same way, when you do validations, you're introducing a dependency on that. There's no way to abstract from that. There isn't really a common interface for those kinds of things. So you can't decouple that, realistically. Rendering a template. Who uses render, the method? Vast majority of you, yeah. The thing is, again, there, you're actually introducing a dependency on twig bundle twig in doing that. And that's just one method name, right? Render. How simple should that be to abstract into an interface? And I have good news. People are actually working on this, or they will be soon. There are a number of people that want to introduce this to the Fig. It hasn't gone through an entrance vote and stuff like that. So you might be able to decouple that in the future. But that's only one method name, so it's not the end of the world. Forms, validators, etc. This is your actual creation of a form, those form classes that you have. Again, you're introducing direct dependencies there on the validator and on the form. It makes less sense to decouple this, because ultimately you're always going to be relying on those individual validations, which are going to be provided by the validator component or whatever. So actually, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense to decouple this, because ultimately, if you switch frameworks, then you're going to have to rewrite all of this stuff anyway. Sorry. Entities. Entities are relatively abstract concepts. They're just objects with a bunch of methods which just simply get and set on that object, and then you have a bunch of properties which are what you're manipulating, that data you're manipulating. So actually, they're relatively decoupled. There are two problems with this though. One is who uses annotations for their doctrine configuration, and who uses YAML? Okay, fair enough. I don't like YAML for this, but it's personal preference. So annotations, YAML configuration, that's something that you can't decouple. One day you might be able to. I can't really, as far as I know, nobody is working on that. So that's not something you're going to be able to decouple. But that's something that should be relatively simple to change if you ever switch ORM or something like that. But essentially, all of those annotations and that configuration you have, that's a direct dependency on doctrine. Now, when you're writing that in a YAML file, that's less obvious, and you don't really think about the fact that you're actually introducing a dependency on doctrine, because you're not referencing the ORM class or anything like you are in an annotation, but you are. The other thing is collections. So if we think about our entity classes and we think about all the type hints, etc., most of them are scalar type hints or objects within our application of other objects, entity value objects in our application. However, we have collections, and collections are normally a direct dependency on doctrine. There are certain people that are currently discussing a way of abstracting that, but that would also probably require a bunch of stuff in PHP internals to change. Collections are also really hard. Any of you that have done a computer science degree will know that collections in PHP and the way we handle arrays is not really how you should, and therefore trying to do it properly is really difficult. The model, database abstraction layers. Ultimately, most of the time you're depending on a specific dependency abstraction layer. There's nothing really much you can do about that. You can use PDO, and there has been some talk about creating a PDO interface that will work for more database abstraction layers. That hasn't happened. Maybe it will one day. And finally, configuration. So Bo, I don't know if he'll mention this in his talk that he does tomorrow. He mentioned it last time he did this talk. Resource location, trying to find those mapping YAML files, those routing YAML files, and loading them. There isn't a consistent way of doing that. I know container service definitions, which is actually kind of a really important thing if you've got a library, of being able to just say, grab all those services that you want to suddenly introduce to the dependency injection container. And that would actually reduce the need of the use of glue, as much glue as you'd need. But that would be a really great thing to introduce into libraries. So 10%, that's as realistically as much of your actual business logic you can really decouple completely from your individual components. And you will look really depressed, which doesn't surprise me, because it depresses me too. But maybe one day we'll get a bit further. Finally, I'm just going to talk very quickly about integrating applications. So you have an easy publish install, and you have a phpBB install, or you have a Drupal install and a phpBB install. And then you have a Symfony application. And you want to share things between these. So how are you going to do it? This is the most crude way. Who's done this? Just simply added into their Symfony a separate database connection to their Drupal database. And just they'll connect to that and run queries. Vast majority of you. This is a crude way of doing it, but realistically it works. And taking a pragmatic approach instead of an optimistic or perfectionist one, actually manipulating that Drupal database directly is sometimes the fastest way of handling it, and sometimes it's a better way. Not necessarily Drupal, but whatever other applications you're trying to interact with. User providers and sessions. Now, I'm not going to go into this in a great amount of detail. It's a huge topic. Go and read the Symfony book. User providers and sessions. Being able to share users between these different applications is kind of hard. It requires quite a lot of time. And the idea is this should be some of the glue in your application. And there are bundles to do most of this. And I would call these bridges. These are bridge bundles. Whether that's a bridge between phpBB and Drupal, for example, even if they use the same security component from Symfony, that would allow the APIs to interact with each other a little bit better. But ultimately, you're still probably going to want to each have their own user systems and then just have them talk to the same kind of data source. Templating. Who has a whole load of different applications that want to share the same header and footer? Okay, a few of you. There's not really an easy way of doing that either. And this talk is getting more depressing as it goes on, I feel. Because I'm basically telling you just can't do things. Hopefully some of you will go and find solutions and then try and fix the world, but you know, fixing the world is hard, right? So templating, trying to share things. If you have Twig templates on all of your different applications, it makes life slightly easier in that you can do that copy-paste thing that we talk about a lot. It's also possible that if you've got your applications in the same place, you can just share those templates. You can point them at each other. But the thing is, then you're requiring that those two applications always coexist. And essentially, then you've added a quite tight dependency between your two applications. If you want to do functional testing, for example, you would suddenly need to have both of them in place. Anything that would actually load those templates, you would need to have your base templates in place. So to be honest, the best way of doing that for now is just simply using the same templating syntax. And if you have two different things that use a different templating syntax, then Twig has the ability to write lexers. If you want to have a look at what Symfony docs say a lexer is, it will be about 10 lines. If you want to look at what a real lexer looks like in changing a complete templating syntax to another one, go and have a look at phpBB, because we have about maybe about 800, 900 lines of regex that is our lexer. It was the most horrible part of converting phpBB over to Symfony, in my opinion, or Symfony ecosystem stuff. Or use an API. So I don't know what Drupal's API actually looks like, but if the nicest and cleanest way to be able to interact between these applications is just simply using an API. So standards or libraries. I talked a bit about abstraction libraries. I'm running a bit behind on time, so I'm just going to speed up a bit. Zend framework, Zend expressive, they have a routing library and a templating library, and what they do is they abstract away from you requiring on a specific templating library or whatever. So for example, their routing component supports Aura, their Zend one, the fast route, doesn't support Symfony yet. However, they're looking at introducing this to the Fig, at which point it then might start to. They do a similar thing with their routing component. I mentioned PPI as an abstraction library earlier. This one up here, anyone know what that is? A couple of you. It's PHP HTTP, and they produce something called HTTP plug. And the idea of that is that it provides an abstraction of an HTTP client, and they're looking to introduce that to the Fig as well. You also have those bridges, those bundles that I mentioned earlier. Just search for Drupal phpBB integration on Google, and you'll find stuff like that. Interfaces. By interfaces, I mean not just a container interface in your Symfony application and you're using the Symfony container interface. I mean standards. I mean something that's not produced by any particular one of these projects, but is produced abstractly away from that. Fig. And the idea of that is that then lots of different projects can then adapt these and work on them together. So just to conclude, interoperability means that you can drop in libraries, you can switch them in and out. Libraries shouldn't care about which individual library you're using for caching, for example, which makes that dependency resolution a lot easier. It makes your compose.lock file a lot lighter, your vendor file a lot lighter, and your life a lot easier. Reducing duplicate functioning libraries. Having 3 caching libraries is just a pain to maintain if you've got that in your application. You've got to put them all in different directories and stuff like that. It's a bit of a nightmare. Separation of concerns is really important. You should only have 3 things in your application: your business logic, your glue, and your libraries/framework, and they should be completely separate. Try and keep them so. And you can accomplish that with either interfaces, Fig, abstraction libraries, PPI, HTTP plug, or bridges. And I've overrun ever so slightly, so there's not a huge amount of time for questions, but Anne-Sophie will kill me, but I'm going to say any questions anyway. Or do you want to go and have a drink of coffee before the next talk?